So let me just begin by giving you a framework to think about this whole question of state building. In my view, any modern liberal democracy has got three separate sets of institutions that are all independently important and critical. The first is the state itself, and as Gia Nodia noted, we political scientists like to use Max Weber's definition. A state is a legitimate monopoly of power over a defined territory. And in that definition, these four terms, legitimate, monopoly, power, and territory, are all very important. NGOs don't do this, labor unions don't do this, voluntary associations don't do this. Only states can exercise that legitimate monopoly of force. There's a second set of institutions which has to do with the rule of law. As my colleague Eric Jensen can tell you at some length, there are probably as many definitions of the rule of law as there are law professors. The one that I think is really critical from the standpoint of a political system is the following, that the rule of law is a set of agreed upon rules of justice, but in order for it to be truly called the rule of law, it has to be binding on the most powerful actors in the society. So that if the president or the prime minister or the king or whatever can make up the rules as they go along, that's not the rule of law. It doesn't matter whether those rules are applied to everybody else, but if they don't apply to the most powerful people in the society, it's not the rule of law. And therefore, and we can distinguish between the rule of law and rule by law, which are simply commands of the executive. But what we really want are these restrictions on executive power. And then the final set of institutions has to do with accountability. Now, I thought it was interesting in the morning's discussion, this question of whether this should simply be democratic procedures like free and fair elections, or whether there is a more substantive definition of accountability that has to do with the true responsiveness of a political system to the interests of the whole society, as opposed to being responsive only to the interests of the ruling elite. My own view is that these overlap very, very substantially. That the reason that we have procedures is to guarantee that there be substantive accountability. But I do have to acknowledge that procedural accountability and substantive accountability are sometimes not always the same thing, because I think we all know of countries that follow democratic procedures where there's a high degree of corruption, ineffective government, unresponsive public officials, and that's not substantively accountable. And by contrast, I think that there are big differences between some authoritarian regimes, like that in Singapore, and let's say that in North Korea or Zimbabwe, where the latter really have no feeling of responsibility or responsiveness or substantive accountability to their populations, whereas I would say the government of Singapore is pretty responsive. Nonetheless, I think procedures are really important, and that involves free and fair elections of the sort that I think we've been able to identify in the international community over the last few years. Now, these three institutions are at odds with each other. There's just no way of getting around this. The state is about power. The state is about concentrating power and being able to use it legitimately to enforce rules, to deliver services, to maintain order and security, to provide basic public goods, and the like. And actually, from my perspective, what I've been doing, as I mentioned this morning, over the past really 10, 15 years, is looking at political development in developing and transitional countries. And I would say that one of the biggest deficits, oftentimes, is not the deficit of the constraining institution. All right, so the state is about power, and the two other institutions are about constraining power. The rule of law constrains rulers, and democracy, democratic accountability, makes sure that it's accountable to the people, right? So there's a tension between the power institutions and the institutions of constraint. And I would say that one of the big problems in many developing countries is the fact that the constrained institutions, I think, especially democratic elections, are actually easier to put in place than the institutions of good state performance. And that's been one of the really big deficits around the world. Certainly if you look at poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it's their lack of stateness that has been the crucial obstacle to their economic and their subsequent social development. And that's why I think the Georgian case, this is why I was actually quite eager to accept the invitation to come to Georgia, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, the state reform that occurred in Georgia was one of the few that seems to have actually been successful. Many countries have been trying to do this over the past couple of decades, and there's been relatively little success in doing this. And I would actually, if I had more time, I would try to demonstrate this to you empirically. But I actually think that whereas we, especially in America, like to argue endlessly over the size of the state, over big government, or whether we should have limited, small government, I actually think that it is possible to demonstrate that the quality of the state matters much more for development outcomes than the size of it. You can have a very large and expansive state, as they do in Denmark or Sweden or other Nordic countries, that deliver services effectively, and they're rich and successful and quite happy. Or you can have a state that is relatively small, like Switzerland or Japan, among developed countries, but also is of high quality, and you can get rich that way as well. The one condition under which you cannot, I think, be successful as a society is if you do not have a state that can deliver services. And the nomenclature is important because, especially in the former Soviet space, when you talk about a strong state, what you usually think about is a state that is repressively strong, able to jail journalists and defeat the opposition. What I mean by having a strong state is really a state that has the capacity to deliver critical public goods, services like health, education, infrastructure, and to do it in an uncorrupt and relatively efficient manner. And I think that if you look around the world, you can put different countries in different categories depending on what combination of state, rule of law, and democratic accountability they possess. And I would say the spectrum right now is in certain ways held by, on the one hand, China, and on the other hand, let's say the United States. China historically developed, I would argue, a model. I'm sorry, I need to, one more definition before we proceed to talking about China. There's another really, really critical definitional point about when you're talking about stateness. And that has to do with, again, what Max Weber distinguished as a patrimonial versus a modern state. All right? A patrimonial state is a state where the state is regarded as a species of private property that's owned by the rulers, by the elites that control the state. According to Weber, a modern state is a state that is impersonal, in which the state seeks to serve a public interest, a broad public interest, and that your relationship to the state does not depend on whether you're a cousin or a friend or a political supporter of the people that happen to be in power at the present moment. It simply depends on your status as a citizen. A modern state is impersonal, and even if it's not democratic, it can still be impersonal in the way that it treats citizens. And I think one of the most difficult transitions is actually that transition from a patrimonial, or what political scientists sometimes call neo-patrimonial state, where the state is just regarded as an object of political competition, and you want to get the state because you want to get rich. How do you make a transition from that kind of a state to a modern state that is impersonal and oriented towards some kind of a public interest? Now, I think that among more developed states, that, you have the China and the United States at opposite ends of the spectrum. China, for historical reasons, I argued in my last book, The Origins of Political Order, was actually the first world civilization, not just to develop a state, but to actually develop a modern state in the sense of a bureaucratic, impersonal administration that treated people on the basis of citizenship. And they did this approximately 2,200 years ago in the 3rd century BC, some 1,800 years before a similar kind of state emerged in Europe, in certain parts of Europe. And frankly, in certain parts of Europe, that kind of modern state has not emerged to this day. I mean, you think Greece and Italy in certain respects. The problem with China was that because this powerful modern state emerged so early in its history, the other two institutions never took root. There was never anything like a real rule of law in China. To this day, this remains true. So the People's Republic of China has a constitution, but the constitution is clearly subordinate to the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party. If it gets in the way, they're simply going to change it or abolish it or go around it. And obviously there's no democratic accountability, but there is a pretty high quality state. On the other hand, I think the United States occupies kind of the opposite end of that spectrum. The American Republic was born in a revolution against the monarchical authority of the British Crown. Americans are very intensely suspicious of concentrated state power. So when the American founding fathers designed the American Constitution, they put into it numerous checks and balances that spread power out, dispersed it among different organizations in order to prevent any one particular power holder from being able to tyrannize over the rest. And I think that in certain ways, there are, in my view, an ideally functioning liberal democracy is one that finds the necessary and the appropriate balance between state power and between those other institutions that constrain state power. And I would say neither China nor the United States has actually found the right balance. The United States is much closer, but neither of them is actually at exactly the right point. China, the problem is obvious, that you've got a very powerful, pretty modern, pretty effective state, in contrast to Russia, let's say, that delivers economic growth, that delivers public services, education, other sorts of things, but it's unchecked. In China, they've got this thing they call the bad emperor problem, that under a good emperor, this kind of a system can be very ruthlessly efficient, but what guarantees that you're always going to have a good emperor? And China has had some really awful emperors in the past, the last of which I think was really Mao Zedong, who was a complete tyrant, and because there are no checks and balances in that system, was able to devastate Chinese society in the way that no democratic politician could ever do. I personally think that in the United States, we've got a problem on the other extreme, that we've got this constitution, this very complex constitution with many, many checks and balances. The kind of debate that we heard this morning is one that, you'd hear a version of this in Washington between Republicans and Democrats, except probably less civil. Well, I guess they're not criminally prosecuting each other, but it's not a pleasant sight. And when you have a highly polarized political elite in a system that divides power the way the American Constitution does, you get the kinds of dysfunctions we've been seeing in Washington in the last few years, where Congress, for example, has not been able to pass a budget by its own rules for the last 6 or 7 years. We had a government shutdown. Things that should be relatively easy to do, like immigration reform or gun control, cannot be done because minority actors in the system are able to very easily veto decisions by the whole. And so every political system, I think, needs to continuously adjust that balance between the power institution, which is the state, and the institutions of constraint, But everybody has to worry about state quality. Everybody has to worry about state quality, including developed democracies like the United States. Now, next question is, where do you actually get one of these modern states? I think that historically, and this is what my last two books have really been about, historically, one of the biggest drivers of state modernity in this sense has actually been military conflict. This is what created the Chinese state in the 3rd century BC. They fought, these little Chinese proto-states fought 500 years of warfare before you had the emergence of a consolidated, modern bureaucratic state in China. This is the scenario that played out in Europe with countries like Prussia, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and so forth that were highly driven by military necessity. Even in the United States, a lot of the expansion of the American state had to do with conflicts like the Civil War, like World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And I guarantee you what's going on in Ukraine right now is actually good for their state development. There's nothing like a war to concentrate your attention because war and the existential threat that war poses gets people serious about state development. Right? They can't give out jobs to their relatives or take those bribes if they have to worry about losing their national sovereignty in an existential conflict. And so that is one of the tragic features of human existence, that in some sense, it's this kind of existential conflict that has actually driven the growth of institutions. But that's not the only way. And I think actually Georgia is an example of the possibilities of doing things in a more peaceful manner. I think there's what I label the middle class coalition, because as a society modernizes, there are a lot of actors in place that actually don't want a corrupt state. People don't want to have to pay bribes. You don't want to have to get political power in order to get a license to export or in order to get a contract with the government. People would like to have an impersonal state. The problem with political reform is that corrupt patrimonial states benefit existing power holders. This is really why a lot of other countries don't get to where Georgia has gotten, because they've got a lot of people, including most of the existing political elite, that profit from corruption. And you cannot fix that kind of situation unless you can figure out a way to generate a sufficient amount of political power to buy them off, to neutralize them, and to put together a sufficiently powerful coalition of people that want a modern state in order to displace this. And incidentally, this is the story that played out in the United States, because in the 19th century, American government at all levels, federal, state, and local, was highly corrupt. It was completely based on patronage. Every federal employee owed his job or her job to some politician who used that job as a payoff for political support. And the United States created a modern state because of the rise of this kind of a middle-class coalition that did not want that kind of corrupt system. And that's why I was saying that in Georgia, I think you were lucky because of the period after the Rose Revolution. It was possible to generate a sufficient amount of consensus and therefore political power that allowed this kind of state reform to take place. Unfortunately, in many countries, including your own, it really takes an external crisis to concentrate people's attention on this issue and the need to get past these entrenched stakeholders. That's why sometimes the worst crisis actually leads to the biggest opportunities, because that's what creates the political conditions for changing the society. Now, as I said, I do not want to get into an argument, a detailed argument over the current disputes in Georgia. It does seem to me that one of the problems with generating this kind of political power to do this kind of reform is that you get too powerful. and you eliminate a lot of checks and balances, and it shifts the balance from an overly weak state to an overly strong state. And so that's a transition that really has to be negotiated and renegotiated with every passing year, because there's no optimal point of balance in terms of what are the appropriate numbers of checks and balances on the exercise of state power. All you can say, I think, in principle, is that the correct answer for a liberal democracy has to be somewhere in the middle. The state has to be able to generate enough high capacity to do things that its citizens want, but it has to do that under the constraints of law and democratic accountability. All right, so that's a kind of general, overview, I think, of the problem. So let me get to the question of, and I think this might be useful in terms of the next stage in George's evolution, on how a modern state, what it looks like, and how it really develops. So the first, I guess, question has to do with the question of legitimacy. Traditionally, we make a distinction between power and authority, all right? Power is simply the ability to force somebody to do something that you want them to do, whether they want to do it or not. And it could be military power, police power, economic power, whatnot. Authority is somewhat different. Authority is the exercise of power that is regarded by other people as legitimate, and therefore achieves the voluntary compliance of citizens in the exercise of authority. All right? And that means that actually democracy and legitimacy are an important component of power, because in a properly functioning political system, you do not want to coerce people. You really want to buy their voluntary compliance with the state and the state's rules, and therefore legitimacy is absolutely critical. And I would say a further thing, that trust is really the secret ingredient that makes modern effective states work. Citizens have to be able to trust the state sufficiently to let the state exercise authority, and the state has to earn that trust by doing the right things. And so the question then is, how do you build trust in a modern state, and how do you get to this point? And by the way, we can see around the world a lot of very dysfunctional states, and I hate to say it, but the United States is beginning to look more and more like this. But there are many countries in the world in which the state does not perform well. It does not provide the kinds of services and protections that citizens expect. Citizens distrust the state, they dislike it, they want to control it or get it off their backs or encumber it by a lot of rules to protect themselves. And as a result, the state doesn't get the resources it needs to operate, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is true in Latin America, for example. Latin America has one of the highest rates of any region of tax avoidance. And the reason that people avoid paying taxes is they say, well, the state is corrupt. If I pay taxes, it's just going to go into the pockets of some politician. So why should I pay? I'm not going to get any real services. And as you can see, they're trapped in a very bad equilibrium in which the state can't improve because people don't trust the state, and the state is not trusted because it can't perform. And it's very hard to break out of that. So how do you get to a situation that I think is enjoyed by a number of states, particularly in Northern Europe, places like the Netherlands or Switzerland or Germany, Scandinavian countries, in which you are in this opposite equilibrium, which I would call a high trust equilibrium, in which you may have a large state, but it's a state that performs pretty well. Therefore, people are willing to pay their taxes. They're willing to comply voluntarily with laws. They give the state enough resources to do its job properly. It performs, and that leads to a virtuous cycle in which the state's legitimacy is self-reinforcing. So how do you get from the bad equilibrium to the high one? And so we've talked about this already, I think, in the discussion of Georgia this morning, but there are a number of other issues that I think are important. So one is performance. I think This is probably what the previous government recognized. Unless the state actually delivers services, people aren't going to trust it. And I think that's a pretty obvious one. Another really has to do with capacity. Do people believe that the state is able to actually deliver on the kinds of promises that it makes? But the other characteristic, I think, of high-performing states that are trusted has to do with what in American administrative law is called the problem of rules versus discretion. All governments have to delegate power. They have to delegate power to executive agents that then have to use their judgment in the exercise of power. And that is, I think, the central conundrum of government, because the agents, once they get this power, aren't always trustworthy. Sometimes they're corrupt, sometimes they behave to protect their families rather than the state's interest. And so one of the chief issues is, how do you develop a state that has sufficient autonomy that it can exercise good judgment in the pursuit of public interest and yet not abuse that autonomy? And quite frankly, there's no technocratic answer to this, because this is, I think, a constantly evolving trade-off. But I think the answer that I think high-performing states have come up with to this question is actually to develop an impersonal state sector that is, in some sense, protected from a certain kind of routine politics. The design of these institutions has to avoid two pitfalls. It has to avoid the obvious pitfall of excessive autonomy. You do not want to delegate too much authority to the state out of the control of democratic publics. We've, of course, seen many, many abuses of that kind of power everywhere in certainly the former communist world, but in very many dictatorships all over the world. On the other hand, there's another solution at the other extreme that is also not a good one, where you don't trust the state, and as a result, you multiply rules. You multiply rules to constrain the state's behavior. You do not let bureaucrats and public officials exercise their good judgment in terms of resource allocation or deciding on cases, things of this sort. And as a result, the state becomes essentially clogged and inefficient and unable to operate. And again, I would say that China and the United States are kind of examples of both excessive. I mean, China is a good example of excessive autonomy. The things that the Chinese do well is that they're really free of a lot of interest groups and pressure, and they can take difficult decisions, but that's a power that can be abused. And I think that in the United States, India, other democracies, we piled up so many rules that it is actually extremely difficult for states to do things like build roads or infrastructure projects or make simple decisions, commonsensical decisions on the exercise of state authority. With regard to what I think is the task in Georgia, if you look at states that trust their executive branches with sufficient authority to actually exercise power responsibly under democratic control, a lot of that really has to do with the development of a state sector that is sufficiently protected from politics and impersonal, based on a number of things like the capacity, the education, the backgrounds of the people running the state. But there's also a certain important moral component that is involved with professionalization or the way that public officials are socialized. I know that in a lot of discourse by economists, the economists all believe that everybody is just acting in their own private self-interest, and there is no such thing as a public orientation. But I think, as just a matter of historical observation, that is simply not correct. That certain societies develop public bureaucracies that are not devoted to advancing the interests of particular political groups, parties, interest groups, and the like, but have a professional sense of orientation towards a broader public interest, and they are sufficiently protected from the political winds that they can exercise that authority in a way that citizens find trustworthy. And this is, I think, one important question in terms of Georgia's future development, because you can raise capacity and you can raise the performance of the government without creating this kind of a public service. And I think the word service is what's really critical. You can get that better performance over the short run, simply through the exercise of power rather than authority. What's really difficult is actually building authority, that is to say, building a cadre of public servants that are trusted because they are impartial. Now, we've already, broached this subject in the discussion of the rule of law. So the judiciary is the one critical area commonly recognized where this is absolutely important, that legal professionals have to be given the autonomy to promote their own judges and lawyers and bar associations based on their own understanding, their own professional understanding of the law. And you erode the rule of law the moment that you exert undue political influence over these kinds of judicial proceedings. I'm not going to get into the issue of whether this is happening in Georgia today. I'll leave that to the Georgians to work that out. But this is an absolutely critical area where impartiality is the name of the game. You're not going to trust the state unless you believe that those officials are impartial. But it doesn't stop with the judiciary. It also includes the bureaucracy and the civil service. And so if you have a civil service that is regarded as professional and knowledgeable and competent and with the sufficient resources to actually do their jobs, then and in that professionalization sufficiently protected from undue political influence, then I think you have the makings of trust in government and therefore effective government. But this does not mean that the bureaucracy then escapes political control. It's the nature of the political control that is absolutely critical. In, I think, effective parliamentary systems, that has to do with, a certain degree of insulation of the bureaucracy. The political control is exercised really through a single political minister or vice minister. Sometimes these people have trouble controlling recalcitrant bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is not politicized from top to bottom. And again, by the way, I don't think the United States does so well in this respect. We turn over about 4,000 officials every time the Republicans replace the Democrats and vice versa. But I think it is, having that, that cadre of permanent officials, or at least protected officials, that is really important, who can be put under democratic control. Nobody is arguing that that is not important, but the type of democratic control is really important, and the degree to which politicians reach down into the detailed workings of either the judiciary or the bureaucracy is really critical. The politicians acting as principals, directing their agents to do things, need to formulate their demands and their policies in general terms without excessive micromanagement of the way that those decisions are actually implemented. And you cannot trust bureaucrats to implement those decisions. You cannot trust judges to implement those decisions unless they have sufficient capacity. So I would say that the design of the handoff of power from politicians to a permanent or at least a protected judiciary and a civil service is kind of the critical issue in the design of a modern state. And if you delegate too much authority and let officials behave irresponsibly, you've committed one kind of sin. But if you over-politicize any of these functions, you micromanage or you set too many rules, you're committing a sin of a very different sort. Now, so I'm an academic, so I can talk in all these generalities, and I can say to you, you got to get this balance right, and there are these two, Scylla and Charybdis, you have to avoid one and the other, and somehow, you'll just find this happy mean. No country ever finds a happy mean easily, because these are all highly contested, and if you ask me in a follow-up question, so where in Georgia should you draw this line, I'm not going to tell you the answer, because I don't know. I don't know enough about Georgia to be able to actually tell you that, but I do think that that establishes a kind of structure for understanding how to relate democratic political control to the needs of a meritocratic, modern, impersonal government along many dimensions. So that's what I have to say. I'm going to be involved in several more panels and other discussions here in Georgia. I'd love to talk about foreign policy, because I think that's actually something that's pretty darn important right now. I think, in fact, okay, I'll say one word about foreign policy. I actually think that the fight that's going on in Ukraine right now is about this issue. It's the desire, this whole crisis in Ukraine started last winter because the Ukrainians basically want to have an impersonal state. They don't want to have a state, they don't want to have a patrimonial state that is run and looted by its elites for their own self-interest. That was what the real issue was. And they've got this country, this big country there, Russia, that is run in that fashion. Russia is not an impersonal state. There is no rule of law in Russia. It's a state that's basically run by their elites for their own self-interest. That's what's at issue. It's no longer simply democracy versus authoritarianism, but it really has to do with this question of, can we actually have an impersonal state that treats us with some equality as citizens? And that was the issue that was being fought out in Ukraine. That is the kind of issue I would say is going to be fought out in many, unfortunately, many other countries in this part of the world. And this is why I think solidarity around the principles of a modern, impersonal, democratic state, one that balances state power and democratic accountability, is really important. And this is why I think actually all of us owe a considerable amount of solidarity with the Ukrainians who are trying to do this as we speak. So thank you very much for your attention. Maybe I can take just a couple of questions, and maybe we'll just take them in a row. And yeah, how about up here in the front?
Much. This is Sharon Shavadashvili, the publisher of Liberali. It's probably ironic that this question comes from the publisher of the magazine, which is called Liberali. But going back to our main topic, building a modern state in the 21st century, we've seen, as you mentioned, we're seeing numerous examples of successful modern states without liberal democracies. And we also see how the liberal democratic world is quite powerless in the face of challenges that we're seeing today to the world order, and in the case of Ukraine, and not just the case of Ukraine. So maybe we should be asking, we should be bolder in asking the very basic questions that obviously I'm not original in asking this question, but maybe we can have modern states and we can have some form of accountability, with maybe more or less balance without liberal democracy. So is democracy still really relevant in, because another thing that we are seeing is the values that, democratic values and the liberal values that somehow the Western world should adhere to is really, they're not really able to do that. They're not really able to defend their values when, in the face of challenges. So is democracy and is liberal democracy still relevant?
Okay.
I think. Thank you.
Good. Let me take, there was another one. How about in the back there? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, Thank you for giving me the second opportunity to ask the question. In your thesis, in your book, like the famous book, The End of History, I mean, you argue that like ultimately all these systems like will land sort of in liberal democracy, while your colleague Samuel Huntington argues that like let's say it depends on the culture whether the state can adopt the democracy or not. Like, and he has some skepticism towards the states that have like Orthodox religion, that like sort of exercise Orthodox religion. What do you think about the Huntington's sort of belief that Orthodox states are harder to democratize?
Okay. And then, yeah.
Hello, my name is Andrew Dadiani, and today I represent the Open Society Georgia Foundation's board. I have a very specific question, which is an attempt to sort of contextualize what you've mentioned with the previous discussion, trying to avoid the details. How critical you think it is for gaining the citizens' trust, a factor that you've mentioned as very important, and ultimately building a modern democratic state to hold accountable the government officials that were proven to be guilty of committing crimes? Thank you.
Okay, so let me, I think that we're going to probably have to cut it off at the, I'm sorry, but we all have to eat lunch and then we got to leave time for the two panels this afternoon. So let me try to answer. So the first question, is liberal democracy still relevant? Yes, absolutely. I sort of think that we lose perspective given, especially this year with all this stuff going on around us in the Middle East and Ukraine and so forth. But, you know, in the year 1970, there were about 35 electoral democracies and everybody else was some form of authoritarian country. And today the number is 110, 113, something like that. It's been falling in the last few years, but democracy is you know, the form, at least formally, the form of government for 60% of the countries around the world, which is a huge increase over the last two generations, and it's produced a tremendous amount of wealth, and that's part of, you know, and the wealth and the democracy support each other because it's really the growth of middle classes and greater prosperity that gives you the social basis for democracy. And I believe, and this is an issue that I could talk at much greater length about, but I don't think that any of the authoritarian models are in the end sustainable. I don't think the China model is sustainable. I don't think the Singapore model in the long run is sustainable. I think Singapore will be some form of democracy in the next generation as its society matures and so forth. But that does not relieve democracies from the need to constantly adjust their own institutions. I didn't talk about political decay. I mean, there's this discussion about whether Georgia is a consolidated democracy and so forth, but that kind of gives you the impression that once you become a consolidated democracy, you're in the club and you don't have to worry about anything anymore. That's not true. Democracies can, you know, can decay, and I think there's serious signs of decay of American institutions in the United States today, and that's one of the reasons that someone like Mr. Orban can get up and say, well, look at Europe and the United States, they're not such great models. We have to look at our own societies and we have to constantly fix them, and if we don't do this, we're not going to exercise the kind of soft power, the kind of legitimacy that will keep the idea of democracy going around the world. The question about orthodoxy and so forth. So these cultural interpretations are always partially right, right? So if you go around thinking to yourself, culture doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter whether you're Chinese or Muslim or Orthodox or whatnot, you're going to miss a lot of things that go on in a society because culture, in fact, does matter. But the question is, does it account for 15% of the, you know, the behavior or 80% of the behavior? And in most of the cases I've seen, it's actually it's not the dominant factor. I mean, you can change incentives and institutions in ways that are really surprising. So in the early 20th century, Chinese culture was regarded as an obstacle to modernization. You know, Max Weber himself wrote a whole book explaining how Confucian culture was going to hold back China and they were never going to industrialize. And he was wrong, you know. He was wrong about that. So I think that without question, you know, I think this lesson is a cultural matter, more as an institutional one, that it's true that in Orthodox countries there has not been the same kind of separation between the institutional power of religion and the state that has existed in Western Europe, either with the Catholic Church or then, you know, after the Protestant Reformation. And yes, that's made a, you know, you eliminate that check on centralized power and you're going to have more of it. So it has made a difference. Does that mean it's always going to be that way in this part of the world? No, I don't think so. I'm sorry, remind me of the last question.
How critical is it in order to build a modern democratic state and gain citizens' trust, which you describe as
Yeah.
a factor, to hold the...
Oh, yeah, okay, right. So the question is, yeah. I think that there are different ways of achieving accountability, and that there's actually a spectrum from, you know, stronger and less strong forms of it. So, for example, in South Africa, under the apartheid regime, there were a lot of officials that committed really heinous crimes, you know, and they would be crimes even under apartheid era South African law. And what they decided to do was to hold a very different kind of truth and reconciliation process. And that was not a process of justice. I mean, they were basically letting a lot of people off the hook. But Nelson Mandela and the leadership, the new leadership, democratic leadership at that time, said, we want the truth. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. That's what's important. But actually settling scores with every single official in that regime is not going to help our society move forward. And so again, I'm not going to give you a lot of specific advice on how, you know, how to proceed, because it depends on the seriousness of the crime. There are certain things that probably should be fully criminally prosecuted. But I do think that if you look around the world for other ways of achieving accountability, criminal prosecution, given that it's weighted with a lot of other, you know, political implications, is not the only way of approaching this. So I'm sorry, I guess we really need to move on to lunch, so thank you very much for your attention and see you this afternoon.